The 1800s were turbulent times in southern China. The Chinese people were suffering. When word of the California gold rush reached Chinese ports, men began boarding ships bound for San Francisco.
In China, there were literally hundreds of years of problems that were taking place within the country. It revolved around everything from internal civil wars to the Opium Wars with Great Britain. There were problems with famine. A number of ports were ceded over to Great Britain. So the Chinese who had worked on docks and within the ports couldn't even get jobs.
There are lots of European and American ships in southern China already, and they bring news of the gold rush. And that's really how the gold rush became the gold rush. Everybody around the world heard about it.
In the early American West, when gold was discovered, it brought a huge influx of population from across the globe. Aside from the Native Americans who had lived here for centuries, everybody was a foreigner. If you were a Chinese individual, you were just one of many people, and everybody was a stranger in a strange land.
But the Chinese would quickly learn that in this land of opportunity, not everyone thought all immigrants were created equal.
When the Chinese began moving into the United States in the 1840s, 1850s, there are lots of public debates about slavery. This idea that God had even created separate races from the very beginning, that they were unequal.
History records the Chinese being viewed as the most foreign of them all. People looked at them as individuals who dressed differently. The way that they would wear their hair, they wore the queues. The way that they spoke, the language was clearly something that most people would not have any idea what was being said.
People felt that somehow the Chinese quality of life degraded everybody else, that their customs were unacceptable, they weren't Christian.
You get this population that it reinforces their foreignness because they're sticking to themselves, they're not becoming Americanized and all this stuff. How could they? And in addition, they were an easy target because they looked different. History is written by the victors, and in a lot of instances, that unfortunately was not the Chinese migrants that came here and helped build the West.
Initially, they were welcomed. Even the governor of California welcomed the Chinese, but very quickly, the tone shifts, and the Chinese are represented as unfair competition, and they begin passing laws specifically against the Chinese. One of the very first laws that the state legislature in California passed was a foreign miners tax, and that targeted the Chinese in particular. I think estimates are that within the first 3 decades, from the 1850s to the 1880s, Chinese contributed something like 25% of the state revenue from those taxes.
Oregon had a tax similar to the one in California. The counties made quite a bit of money off these foreign miners at the time. Other ways they were targeted was you couldn't buy land unless you lived in Oregon at the time of statehood. So if you were a Chinese individual that came later, you couldn't buy land, which limited what you could do. A lot of places you couldn't stake a mining claim, so you had to buy it from someone else, which meant you could sometimes get a lower quality mining claim. You couldn't have a business without paying a huge fee. You couldn't get married. So all these different aspects of people's lives that translate into building lives and making somewhere your home, there was an obstacle at every turn.
In October of 1885, Tacoma's Chinese residents were given less than 1 month to get out of town. The majority left, but on November 3rd, as many as 200 remained. That's when Mayor Robert Jacob Weisbach led an angry mob of whites through the streets to round them up. The action had clearly been scripted ahead of time.
When that whistle went off, everybody would break from work or whatever they were doing and would, in a supposedly an orderly manner, would gather downtown. It was raining. It was just a crummy November day. The mob assembled in the street and just systematically moved back and forth across the city.
And there were two areas where the Chinese were living. One was near the Old Town area, but there was also an area of land that was leased by the Chinese, and the land was owned by the Northern Pacific Railroad.
There wasn't an intention, like a lynch mob, to necessarily do any harm to anybody, but they weren't going to take no for an answer.
They were going to basically gather up all of the Chinese who were living in Tacoma, transport them to a railroad station in Lakeview, which was that station was about 8 miles south of the core of Tacoma.
Pretty unrelenting results. The Chinese were just brought out of their homes. In most cases, they weren't allowed to bring anything with them, and they were just really literally herded.
And by this time, it's night, it's cold, it's raining. Some of the Chinese that they took out of the Chinatown area were ill, and they had to wait overnight for the train to come.
Those that could afford it were told to buy a ticket south to Portland, and the others were loaded on freight cars.
But not before 2 Chinese reportedly died from exposure during the night. No one knows exactly how many Chinese made it all the way to Oregon, but the consensus is a lot of them did. Lum May was a successful Tacoma merchant who would later testify about what happened, how the Chinese were only given until 1:30 to pack up and leave, how doors and windows were smashed in, how the mob was armed with pistols and clubs, and how his wife lost her reason and threatened to kill people with a hatchet or anything else she could get a hold of, and ultimately how he had been utterly ruined by the experience. Word of the expulsion spread, but not fast enough to stop it.
By the time that all of this word had reached the sheriff in King County and the mayor of Seattle and the territorial governor, Chinatown in Tacoma was already on fire. The following day, the second Chinatown area, or the area that they had leased from the Northern Pacific Railroad, was also set afire. So Chinatown literally, not figuratively, but literally, was completely obliterated before the territorial governor had even had an opportunity to act.
The Tacoma story went to San Francisco and Chicago and was reprinted, and as it got outside of Tacoma, it quickly became characterized as the Tacoma method by journalists in other communities. It was the first time that you had a vigilante action like this, led by a mayor, led by a judge, Judge Wickersham, people that are prominent, high-ranking members of the community.
The expulsion's leaders were known as the Committee of 15. Part of their self-proclaimed agenda included strong-arming businesses and citizens. On October 8th, just shy of 1 month before the expulsion, the committee sent out a letter urging businesses and people not to hire and to fire Chinese. Once the Chinese had been driven out of Tacoma, focus shifted to anti-Chinese rumblings in Seattle.
Seattle's mayor, the sheriff of King County, the territorial governor weren't really sure what to do because they had just witnessed what had taken place in Tacoma. At that point, the territorial governor realizes that they're over their head, because if this kind of thing could happen in Tacoma so quickly, now the focus was on Seattle because Cronin was also in Seattle. And they make the decision that they're going to have to send for federal troops. And so they have to literally get permission from the President of the United States to have the militia and the infantry from Vancouver come to Seattle.
President Cleveland signed an executive order and martial law was declared. The troops stayed in Seattle from November 1885 through January 1886.
And they end up staying here from post-Tacoma expulsion and into January, when people start to breathe a sigh of relief that maybe this isn't going to happen in Seattle. So they send the infantry back to Vancouver. And about that time, they start to notice that there is more of a fevered pitch that is taking place with the expulsionists in Seattle to get rid of the Chinese.
On February 7th, a group of men believed to be members of the Knights of Labor posed as health inspectors and entered Seattle's Chinatown looking for Chinese.
They gather up all of the Chinese in Chinatown and take them to one of the warehouses that's at the dock. So you have literally all of these Chinese that are freezing to death in the warehouse on the dock, awaiting to board the Pacific Queen to be taken to San Francisco. And the only thing that the city is relying on, literally, are deputies that have been sworn in by the sheriff. And together, this kind of motley crew of soldiers were charged with protecting the Chinese and protecting Chinatown from violence. In the meantime, there is just such a scramble. The captain wasn't going to take any passengers that did not have passage paid. So literally, before the Chinese can board the ship, they take up a collection to pay for as many passages as they possibly can.
Judge Thomas Burke had held up the expulsion for a day before the ship set off for San Francisco with a majority of the Chinese on board. But there were still a number of Chinese remaining.
And so they marched them back into Chinatown, and that's when things become really violent. It ends up with at least one person being killed. The Chinese end up literally hitting the ground to try to protect themselves, and there is just this mass mob and riot that is taking place within the city streets of Seattle.